Hi, my name is Brendan Richards from SSW TV, and I'm here at NDC Sydney with Dominick Baier, Mr. Identity Server himself. How are you going?
Hey, how are you?
So my first question is just to ask you about the history of the project and how you got involved and how you decided to make Identity Server.
Yeah, it's a long story.
Oh yeah, sure it is. Take all the time you like.
When I started becoming, working in the security space, I just became fascinated by authentication protocols.
Yeah.
So the first protocol I really tried to understand and look for all the nitty-gritty details was Kerberos, like Active Directory by the time,
yeah.
and it was just fascinating. Yeah, and back in the days, almost all the authentication was happening in the intranet. Right, and then we had this wave where we suddenly did B2B style communication, like SOAP and WCF and WSecurity and WSTrust, and it was just it was such an enormous, complex topic that it really got me excited. And actually, the very first identity server, it was even called Starter STS by the time before it became Identity Server 1, was an implementation of WS Federation and WS Trust. So there were no real products by the time out there. Maybe ADFS, which was a purely Active Directory centered thing. So I thought, like, why not have like a small, lightweight token service that implements these protocols that you can use yourself and, independent of Active Directory, can use in your applications. So that's how it started all. Actually, WS Federation, WS Trust were implemented by .NET itself, at least the building blocks, so I just put them together to become a token service, so to speak. And then the next wave after WSecurity was basically OAuth and OpenID Connect. Yeah. And that was, by the time I was all, full-time already doing consulting around authentication. So these new protocols came up and they solved so many problems that the old protocols couldn't solve, especially WS Trust and SAML and so on. They were not built for the modern style applications like apps and JavaScript and so on. So OAuth and OpenID Connect were like the solution to all these problems. And so I thought, okay, that's the next big thing. But to really claim I understand how they work, I need to implement them from scratch, which is nothing I would recommend to everyone.
No.
But if
yeah,
you are,
glad you have, so I don't have to. Yes,
there's a certain complexity to it. It takes a lot of time. But yeah, so Identity Server 3 was the first OAuth and OpenID Connect. We had some attempts before that and weren't really happy with that, so we started from scratch, built a new Identity Server, and by the time there was the Katana platform from Microsoft just coming out, and that seemed like a really good fit to basically turn the STS into middleware. And so we started before actually the spec was finalized, and were done roughly 6 months after the spec was released. And people used Identity Server before, but it turns out that starting with version 3, with the protocol implementation and all that, we seem to have hit a sweet spot that suddenly this went off the roof, and pretty much these days it's 100% consulting around Identity Server. Not that I planned that. It was a hobby project to start with, actually. More like a proof of concept to prove that I understand how it works.
Yeah.
And now it's become super popular, and it's sometimes even scary when you get emails from huge companies saying, "Oh, we are using Identity Server, and can you do a review for us?" And I thought, wow, I never thought I'm going to take my hobby project to these places. Yeah.
That's right. That's a great story. So another question that's very common people ask around this space is, when would you use Identity Server versus some of the, say, authentication as a service providers? What's the sweet spot? Where does Identity Server fit into the kind of spectrum of options you have available? And it's good to have options because for a while there weren't many.
So the first thing that sometimes people are getting confused with is Identity Server is not a product in itself. It's not something where you click install exe and it installs a server and walks you through a configuration with it. It's a framework. So technically speaking, it's a DLL, right? So a DLL that you use to build your own identity server. And why would you do that? That sounds like a really bad idea to start with. Why would I want to build my own identity platform? So it turns out the whole identity as a service thing is still pretty new to the whole industry. So many people have built products, spent an enormous amount of money building them, but very often you come to customers and you realize that these box products only solve 85% of their problems. Because in my experience, there is never a greenfield scenario for identity. It's always like we have this existing database, or we even have existing databases of users, and we want to consolidate them. And your cloud solution might look nice, but this assumes that all my users are stored in a cloud database. But we have this on-premise thing sitting there. We want to talk to this guy first, and if we find the user, silently migrate him to the new database, or we need to call some really proprietary backend services, or we have very specific rules around authentication or how we onboard a user, or maybe we have to show a EULA to the user that he has to confirm, and it turns out that most of these products you can buy, they have their limits. And that's why we decided to not even try to implement all the use cases, but rather build a framework that just helps you implement these things yourself. So the way I like to think about it is you're building an ASP.NET application that basically has an account controller, right, with all the local logins and external logins and all the custom workflows around that. And then you throw in our middleware, and this basically turns your account controller into an OpenID Connect provider. And from that point on, any modification you want to do to that, standard or non-standard or company specific and so on, it's just normal code, right? And so coming back to your question, I guess the main difference between us and a product is that when you're using our library, you own the code. You need to take responsibility of the code. You need to maintain it. You need to have developers in the company that understand what they're doing, and you have to run it yourself, right? Whereas when you're a company that don't have these developers, that don't want to take the responsibility, you might be better off buying a hosted service if it can fulfill your requirements. And that's still an issue, right? But there are also situations where these commercial products completely work for you, or maybe sometimes you for the benefit of having not to care about it yourself, change the way your company works to fit into their model, if that's an option for you. So it's pretty much build your own versus buy something.
And related to that, do you think being open source is really important? Because I personally believe that if you're going to be using something for security, you need to be able to see from your own perspective, being able to see the source code and understand it properly is important to me. But do you see that as important to most people?
It is. I think it is important. I don't think that many people that use Identity Server ever went to the source code. I think if they don't have to, we did a good job.
Yeah, true.
We, after these many years of doing consulting and all that, we think we give them the right extensibility points so that they never ever need to change our source code to make their scenario happen. So you can have, if they would need to do that, I think we would need to change Identity Server to accommodate for that. But in the last couple of years of using the library, we never ever had to modify the source code, which I think is a success story for the programming model, I guess.
It's a good story.
And yeah, I mean, coming back to that, for security research, it definitely helps to have it as open source.
Yes.
I think open sourcing it. I mean, it was open source from day one, but obviously open source 10 years ago was a little bit different in the Microsoft space, at least, than it is today. 10 years ago, it was more like, here's the source code, but you can't change it. Whereas today, you know, with GitHub and all that, so we have, I just looked it up, we have 80 contributors to Identity Server. I mean, you know, many people just come in and fix grammar in the docs, but that's still super important. I mean, contributing to documentation is something I very much appreciate, because we all, you know, no one enjoys writing documentation. And if somebody wants to improve that, I'm very happy about that. But also we have sometimes very, very good contributions. So even the one I liked the most was like happening 1 or 2 years ago, where someone, actually from Australia, he got 2 weeks off from his company and said, like, on your company time, contribute to some open source project you want. And so he contacted us and said, okay, listen, I have these 10 days. Can you give me a task so I can implement that? And we had something which, you know, was on our to-do list, wasn't, you know, we didn't have time to do it. And he said, okay. And I basically just gave him the URL to the spec he has to implement. And 10 days later, it was like a super clean implementation, including test coverage and everything. And
fantastic.
So these things happen.
And that's just, if you don't go the open source route, that's a story you just can't tell. Every single feature has been plugged in by the same people. You don't get those ideas and new blood coming in to keep your...
I mean, just today I spoke to a couple of people at the conference and said, like, wouldn't it be cool if you could do this or that? And I said, yeah, you know what? Open an issue. That sounds like a reasonable thing to do. Well, let's, you know, start a discussion around that,
So my next question, I really enjoyed your talk earlier today, and one of the big takeaways I took with it was being very clear in your mind of the difference between authentication and authorization. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about yourself and kind of get that point across.
So the story behind it is that, you know, we have built Identity Server, which is all about authentication. And it's almost like a turnkey solution for many, many scenarios. So people ask us then, is like, can't you also provide us a turnkey solution to, you know, after we know who the user is, what is he allowed to do in the application? And it turns out that this problem is much, much harder to solve than authentication, because this is very application specific. Where with authentication you can have recipes, kind of like if you're building a spa, it works like that. If you're building a native application, it works like that. And if you have both, there's a pattern to make them both work. For authorization, it's almost like you talk to 10 developers and they get like, you have 15 patterns how to implement it, right? And the thing we saw is, because there's so much confusion around that, is that people started abusing the identity system as an authorization platform. So basically you say, okay, so now we have this central thing here, so and it produces these tokens. Can't we just add stuff to these tokens, like, you know, he's allowed to add a record, or he, you know, like you can delete a document, stuff like that. And while this might sound like a pragmatic solution to start with, it's very troublesome, because
it doesn't scale well, does it? You end up with bigger and bigger.
The tokens get bigger and bigger. The thing is, in OAuth, the concept of OAuth is that you are asking for a token to be used to use multiple services. So what if you now have a permission that has different meanings in different services? What if this user is an admin in one service but a user in another? How would the recipient of the token need to be able to distinguish that this permission is for me, but this permission is for someone else? And you end up with a super complex system, like a big ball of mud. Basically, you know, this token has all kinds of concerns now in it, and it creates problems. And the worst part is that once you have a claim in your token, that's easy to add. But removing it again because you want to clean up is very hard, because now suddenly all kinds of applications have dependencies on the existence of this thing, and when you remove it or change the semantics of it, all stuff breaks. And in this case, security stuff breaks. And breaking might mean that there is now a subtle security hole in one of the applications that no one ever finds until being exploited, maybe. Because
that's right, you don't get a runtime error, you don't get a compile time error just because you turn something off. It's always the users that find these issues, and hopefully they find it where they're locked out of something they shouldn't be, not they're allowed to do something they shouldn't be.
So for the last the trend we are seeing is, looking at the consulting jobs we did, is that I helped many companies recently to actually get rid of that again.
Yes.
Yeah, and it turned out it was hard. So, so we looked at all of these implementations and whatever, and we found that there seems to be some common ground in authorization, and it's around role-based authorization and permissions, right? So you are in a role, and the role fans out to these permissions, and so and we looked at how would you do that, and so we came up with this other concept, like when you have an identity provider, which is just for the identity of the user, you have a separate piece of infrastructure called an authorization provider that basically takes the identity as an input, but then the output will be the permissions. And even more important, the output will be the permissions for the application that's asking for it, right? Because as I said, the same user might have different permissions in different applications or APIs. So I think scoping the permissions to the consumer of these permissions is very, very important. And that's what an identity token can't give you. Right, because an identity token or a token that contains identity is going to be reused in many places, and you need the context. Without the context, these permissions are pretty much meaningless.
And with that, would you see you've got the sort of single authentication provider? The authorization providers, you could have multiple. You split them up into.
Yeah, it's not really important if it's one or if it's multiple. I think the important point is to separate them, separation of concerns.
Yes.
Yeah, some people, want to have one, so you can go there and see all the applications you have and configure which user is allowed to do what. That's fine. If that gets too big, this might create a bottleneck, right? Like today in many Active Directory-based systems, you want to have a new group, you have to fill out a form and hand it in to an admin, and and maybe in 3 weeks you will get your group. So I think this could easily follow your organization structure. So we have customers who have only one, but we also have customers where the software development has different departments, so each department has one. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be an enterprise-wide concern. It's an application concern, and I more like to think of it as a logical separation than physically. I don't care too much if it's spread out or if it's just one. Yeah.
And so, what's coming up next for Identity Server? I know also you've been talking about a separate authorization provider. Is there any plans to release that as a product?
Yes, so I think that if we're going to release something in that space, which we will pretty sure we'll do, which sounds like a contradiction to the last thing I said, it probably won't be an open source product. I mean, not in the sense of that maybe the source code is completely private, but it's more a practical means that Brock and I, we have, 5, 6 open source projects, and we are completely running out of resources maintaining them. So if we're going to build another one, it's going to be a commercial one, because open source, doesn't really pay the bills. No, so we still think that parts of it will be open source, especially the client libraries and these things, but maybe the server piece might be a commercial thing. We don't really know exactly what we do. For Identity Server, the next steps for me are there are some new specs that are being finalized right now. One is about device authentication. So that's a topic that's coming up more and more. So maybe you've seen that, like when you want to pair your TV to your Netflix account, for example, they use this pattern that they show you like a number on the screen, and then you go to your computer, you log into Netflix, and then you type in that number you're seeing on the screen, and then that's pairing things in the background. So many of these services now have a proprietary implementation of that, but there's now a spec called the device flow that's on my to-do list of things to do. The other thing,
see that being more and more important as you get more and more devices as well.
Yes.
Like the number of
or you could even imagine, you like in the IoT space where you buy something, it has a QR code on it. You take a picture with your phone, and then that there are all kinds of scenarios.
Yeah.
Basically for devices that have limited input capabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a TV, you really don't want to type in your 30-character random password on a remote control, like with a cursor, like going through all the things. So that's becoming more important. That's on our to-do list as soon as the spec is finalized, which is soon. The other really hot topic right now in that space is financial APIs.
Of course, yeah.
So especially in Europe, there are new laws about banking, and there's the Open Banking Initiative, and there's a whole spec around financial APIs. And what these specs are basically defining is like a minimum security level. Like if you want to have read access to a banking API or want to have write access, and which technologies have to be used. And it's not like inventing something new, but it's creating new profiles. Like, have a profile financial API, and you basically say it's a read API or it's a write API, and then you can enforce certain security standards, like authentication strength and the way the tokens are going to be transmitted. That's another important thing we're looking into. And of course, everybody who's in the ASP.NET Core space knows that we have to upgrade to the new version. They released yesterday.
Right. Yes, I'll keep you busy.
And it turns out they haven't changed too much in ASP.NET Core 2, but they changed the security infrastructure. And that's the one we have a dependency on. So probably after I'm done today with my talks and everything, tomorrow morning I'm going to download the new Visual Studio and start working on that. Yeah.
Well, good luck with that. So one final sort of fun question. If you had a time machine and could go back, say, 2 years, a year, and just give yourself one piece of work-related advice, sort of one mistake you've made recently that, if you just had that piece of information, what would you go back and tell yourself?
That advice would have been, wait until .NET Core has been finalized.
Yes, I think.
Because we've been following, all the way from Project K to ASP.NET, DNX, we've been following all that, and every time there was a new beta version, we had to rewrite all our stuff. And
I wasn't expecting the bleeding edge to bleed quite so much, has to be said.
No, I mean, on one hand it was interesting, on the other hand it was, we lost a lot of time just keeping up with the changes that got put in, then rolled back again, and then changed completely, and then...
Yeah, those little API changes that just break it, and you have to... And
it's the little ones I'm not so concerned about. It's like when they just, change the complete runtime.
Yes.
Like between, I don't know, what was that, release candidate 1, and then to 2, right? DNX went away, .NET Core came on board.
That's right.
But I think this applies to many of these. So, for example, I won't implement specs anymore until they're finalized as well. It's it's just so annoying sometimes that you wrote the code and then you realize, oh, they changed that, and I mean.
Well, that's right. You get bugs that are totally not your fault. You had it working perfectly, and then there's framework changes on you, and you've got to do all this bug fixing, and you did nothing wrong, but you still have to do
and also the realizing that most people are not as bleeding edge as you are.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't need to be on the latest and greatest. Be on the most stable one. Maybe is the better thing.
What it did mean, though, is when .NET Core released, you were ready with Identity Server, and so straight away we had a perfectly working Identity Server for us. As a user, I thank you for your suffering.
When we finished version 3 on Katana, I thought like, okay, we are done. That's the last one we're ever going to write. And then almost like 6 months later, they said, oh, Katana, by the way, Katana will be discontinued. We're going to do something completely new.
That's right.
I said, oh, okay, then let's do that. But this one will be the last one. So I don't know. I'm not regretting that. It's just sometimes just give it a little bit more time.
Yeah.
Especially now, since you can have the nightly builds and everything, and yeah. I very well remember that I basically spent all my Christmas holidays 2 years ago getting ready for RC1 of ASP.NET Core, and we released our RC1 to go with that on a Wednesday morning at NDC London, and 3 hours later there was Damien Edwards and David Fowler on stage saying, oh, by the way, we're going to change everything.
Quite painful.
So my wife says, thank you for that, right? Thank you for spending your Christmas holidays in your office. So maybe next time I wouldn't do that.
No. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You have been watching SSW TV at NDC Sydney, and follow the links below for more awesome videos from SSW. Thank you for watching.